Hi guys, and welcome to Quiet Voice Podcast channel. Tonight we walk into Virginia when the air is thick with leaf smoke, damp earth, and the sour sweetness of crushed tobacco. You can almost feel the river mist settling over the fields, hear frogs in the marsh grass, and sense the long, uneasy silence between one command and the next. What really happened here, on these farms that made fortunes across the Atlantic? What did daily life feel like for Black Americans whose hands turned green tobacco into golden profit for other people? The answer is not the tidy plantation myth. It is harder, stranger, and far more human. So, before you settle into the story, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, and while you're here, comment below with your location and your local time, now. Dim the lights, and let yourself step into Virginia when tobacco was not just a crop, but a demanding master that bent nearly every hour of life around its leaves. You arrive first by water. That is how Virginia often introduces itself. A broad river slides past muddy banks, carrying barrels, gossip, mosquitoes, and ambition. The tide breathes in and out with a patient authority, as if the land itself cannot decide whether it belongs to the sea or the forest. Along the shoreline stand rough landings, wooden warehouses, and scattered buildings with weathered boards. Behind them stretch tobacco fields, pale green in some months, dark and sticky in others, with rows so straight they almost look calm. They are not calm. The farms of Virginia built their wealth on tobacco because European demand for the leaf remained enormous for generations. Smoking, sniffing, chewing, trading, boasting. It was a habit with an empire attached. A man in London might tap ash from a pipe and never think about the fingers that planted his pleasure. Yet those fingers, stained by labour, belonged to people whose days were measured by the crop's relentless needs. You feel the ground first. It is soft in wet weather, powdery in drought, stubborn all year. Soil clings to ankles and hems, sand works into shoes, clay grips wagon wheels. Nothing here feels effortless, though the advertisements of the age might have suggested Virginia as a place where prosperity simply sprang from the earth. That fantasy fades quickly when you smell the sweat, dung, and wood smoke that hang around any working farm. Black life on Virginia tobacco farms did not begin as one single story. That is part of the trouble. Some came directly from Africa through the slave trade, forced across the Atlantic in conditions so cramped and filthy that survival itself became a harsh lottery. Others were born into bondage in Virginia, inheriting legal unfreedom before they could even stand upright. A smaller number in the earlier colonial period passed through a world that was more unstable and less fixed, where servitude, race, and status had not yet hardened into the full legal machinery that later defined slavery in British North America. That early uncertainty did not last. As the 17th century moved onward, Virginia lawmakers built a stricter racial order. Laws increasingly tied African descent to permanent hereditary slavery, especially through the status of the mother. This mattered with chilling efficiency. It meant bondage could reproduce itself. No purchase was needed when the system could claim children from birth. You can almost hear the legal language doing its quiet work, colder than a whip because it aimed to outlive any one planter. The tobacco farm becomes the stage where those laws turn into daily routine. Morning begins early, usually before the sun has fully warmed the mist. A horn may sound, a voice may call out. A door opens on hinges that complain into the dark. Inside a cabin the air is close and smoky, with the smell of ash, damp wool, and bodies sleeping in limited space. Straw pallets rustle. A child shifts. Someone coughs. Someone reaches for coarse clothing that never feels entirely dry. You wake not to possibility, but to obligation. And the crop waits. Tobacco is fussy. It demands clearing, hoeing, hilling, transplanting, worming, topping, cutting, curing, sorting, packing. It does not politely keep to one season of hardship. Its care stretches across the year with 1,000 repetitive motions. You bend. You lift. You pinch off flowers. You inspect leaves for insects. You work beneath the full heat of a Virginia summer, while horseflies drift near your face like tiny curses with wings. Not glamorous, planters often described tobacco as delicate and valuable, but that language had a habit of erasing the people whose constant attention made delicacy possible. Black workers knew the plant with an intimacy owners preferred not to honour. They knew how young seedlings reacted to cold snaps, how worms could ruin a patch with startling speed, how leaves changed feel as they ripened, how a badly timed rain could spoil hopes and tempers alike. Expertise lived in the hands of the labourers, even when authority did not. That imbalance shaped everything. You might imagine a large plantation with a grand house rising above endless acres. Sometimes that existed. But Virginia also contained smaller farms, middling operations, and uneven holdings where wealth and pretension came in different proportions. Not every tobacco grower was a silk waistcoat tyrant gliding around with theatrical villain energy. Some were insecure men with muddy boots, ledgers, debts, and grand ideas about their own importance. In some ways, that made them no less dangerous. A man does not need elegance to be oppressive. Sometimes all he needs is ownership backed by law. The work gang moves into the field with hose over shoulders. The morning air still holds a trace of coolness, though not for long. Birds make quick, bright sounds from the tree line. Somewhere nearby a cow lows. The smell of river mud mixes with crushed green leaves underfoot. You can feel dew soaking the edge of your clothing as rows swallow you one by one. Labour on these farms was rarely a single undifferentiated blur. Some people planted, some hoed, some tended livestock, some cooked, some nursed children not their own. Some served as drivers, occupying a painful and narrow space between coercion from above and resentment from below. Some were coopers, blacksmith, or carpenters. Tobacco wealth depended on many kinds of skill. Even so, field labour remained central, grinding and exhausting. Women worked there too. The old romantic myth likes to place black women only in kitchens, cabins, or beside cradles, as if the field belonged to men alone. Virginia tobacco farms tell a different truth. Black women planted, weeded, hauled, processed, and endured the same sun that pressed on everyone. They did domestic labour as well, because the system had a greedy habit of wanting every possible kind of work from the same body. A woman might move from field rows to food preparation to washing to childcare with barely a pause wide enough to count as rest. The children were drawn in early, not always at once, and not all in the same way, but childhood on a tobacco farm could shrink fast. Younger children carried water, fetched wood, scared birds from crops, gathered scraps, or minded infants. Older children entered heavier labour. There was no sentimental age of innocence protected by gentle custom. There was usefulness, and usefulness arrived early. Yet life was not only labour. That matters because people were not machines, though the system tried very hard to treat them as such. In the evening, after the field released its grip, some cabins filled with low conversation, shared food, mended clothing, and the small domestic rhythms that make human life human. Cornmeal might cook in an iron pot, smoke might sting the eyes, hands cracked from work might braid hair, patch cloth, rub sore shoulders, or cradle a baby with astonishing tenderness. In such spaces, people built kinship under conditions designed to fracture it. Families existed even when owners refused to respect them. A marriage could be real to the couple, sacred to the community, and still be invisible in law. A child could know exactly who their people were, and still remain vulnerable to sale, hiring out, or forced separation. That instability haunted ordinary affection. To love someone in bondage required courage because the world around you kept proving that love offered no legal shield, and still, people loved, quietly, stubbornly, beautifully. Religious life also found room to grow in unlikely soil. On some farms, enslaved people encountered Christianity through planters, missionaries, or local churches, though often in forms meant to emphasize obedience. But Black Virginians did not simply receive ideas as blank slates. They interpreted, adapted, and carried older spiritual understandings alongside newer teachings, songs, prayers, whispered hopes, Funeral customs and healing practices moved through cabins and quarters in ways the ledgers never captured. There were also traces of African knowledge that persisted through foodways, craft, agriculture, and medicine. Some herbal remedies passed from hand to hand. Some beliefs blended over time into new forms. Some customs vanished under pressure. Historians still argue about how much can be firmly traced, and how much must be understood as careful possibility rather than certainty. The archive is uneven, and silence in the record often hides a great deal more than it reveals. That silence can be deceptive. Plantation records are full of numbers, inventories, punishments, crop totals, and purchases. They can tell you how many pounds of tobacco a farm shipped, how much a planter owed a merchant, how much cloth was issued, how many tools were bought. But numbers are poor company when you want to know what fear smelled like in a rainstorm, or how homesickness felt when spoken in a language an owner could not understand. The people closest to the work were often denied the chance to preserve their own words on equal terms. So you learn partly by reading against the grain. You notice the sudden appearance of expense entries for shoes, blankets, iron pots, or medicine. You notice births recorded as property increase. You notice punishments mentioned casually, with a sort of tone that reveals how normalized cruelty had become. You notice a labourer described as valuable because he is skilled with tobacco curing, or a woman marked as a good field hand, as though the phrase could contain a life. It never can. The tobacco itself changes as the year turns. Early leaves feel soft and green. Later the plants grow taller, broader, and more pungent. When cut, they release a wet, bitter scent that catches in the throat. Harvest time brings urgency. Leaves cannot simply lounge about waiting for convenience. They must be handled, hung, cured, and guarded against spoilage. Barns fill with a warm, almost suffocating smell, sharp and sweet together. The perfume of money for one group and compulsion for another. Inside a curing barn, the air can feel thick enough to chew. Leaves hang overhead in clustered lines, drying slowly in dim light. Dust floats through narrow beams from the cracks. Boards creak. Somewhere outside, insects trill in the evening grass. It is almost peaceful for a moment, until you remember what every hanging leaf represents. Long hours, controlled bodies, lives pressed into commodity form. The whole Atlantic economy seems to hover there in the rafters, disguised as agriculture. There is a quirky little fact buried in this world, and it tells you something about labour and risk. Tobacco worms, the plump green caterpillars that could devastate crops, had to be picked off by hand. Imagine row after row under summer heat, fingers moving leaf to leaf, searching for pests, crushing them, and moving on. No grand theory, no dramatic speech, just endless vigilance against a creature no bigger than a thumb. An empire, it turns out, could depend partly on who was ordered to remove caterpillars in August. Owners worried constantly about profit. They worried about weather, blight, shipping, debt, and market prices. They also worried about control. The same people whose knowledge made the farm productive were the people they feared could resist, flee, feign illness, work slowly, damage property, or build lives beyond the master's script. That anxiety shaped surveillance. It shaped punishments. It shaped how close cabins stood to the main house, how movement was watched, how gatherings were interpreted. And yet no system sees everything. A laugh around a fire. A warning passed in a glance. A song carrying more meaning than an outsider hears. A bit of food tucked aside. A story told softly to a child half asleep. These things may look small from a distance. They were not small to the people living them on farms built to extract labour. Moments of selfhood mattered with a force that can seem almost miraculous. So what really happened to black Americans on tobacco farms in Virginia? They laboured under a racial system designed to make their work permanent and profitable. They endured exhausting agricultural routines in heat, mud, smoke, and uncertainty. They built families and communities in spaces that could be invaded at any moment. They carried knowledge that kept the crop alive, even while others claimed the credit. They lived inside danger, but not only inside danger, there was skill there. There was memory. There was humour, faith, grief, irritation, care, and the ordinary stubborn pulse of being human in a place determined to turn human life into output. The river keeps moving past the farms, brown and reflective under the fading sky. Frogs begin again. The cabins glow faintly with firelight. Tobacco leaves rustle in the barn like paper secrets. Night gathers over Virginia, and the land grows quiet in the way working landscapes sometimes do, not because hardship is absent, but because it is tired enough to sleep. You begin in motion, because motion was often the cruel beginning. No one simply drifted into the tobacco world of Virginia by accident. People were pushed, sold, inherited, marched, shipped, and legally trapped into it. The road to the fields might start on the West African coast, in the hold of a slave ship, at a courthouse, in a port town, at an estate sale, or in the cradle of an enslaved mother. Each path was different in detail. Each could end in the same rows of tobacco. The Atlantic crossing remains one of the darkest doors into this story. Men, women, and children taken from African societies were forced onto ships built for profit, not mercy. The air below deck turned foul with sweat, sickness, waste, and terror. Bodies were packed in ways that denied dignity and strained survival. Water ran short. Disease spread quickly. Some people died before the ship ever touched Virginia soil. Others survived only to be sold into a new world that had already decided their labour belonged to somebody else. You can almost feel the strange stillness after disembarkation. A person survives the sea, steps onto land, and finds that survival has changed very little. The language around them is unfamiliar. The trees look wrong, the birds sound wrong, the air smells different with swamp dampness, wood smoke, and river salt where home should be. Faces study them not as neighbours, but as inventory. Buyers look at teeth, limbs, scars, age, and posture with the hard gaze of people pricing a horse. It is a scene of inspection that tells you immediately what the market intends. Virginia was deeply tied to this trade, though the flow of people shifted over time. In the earlier colonial years, there were more legal ambiguities than later generations like to admit. Some Africans in 17th century Virginia moved through systems of labour that overlapped in confusing ways with indentured servitude. A few achieved freedom, a few held land, a few even entered court records as property holders themselves, which is one of those awkward truths that does not fit neatly into schoolbook simplicity. Yet none of this meant the colony was generous. It meant the system was still hardening, and harden it did. By the late 17th and early 18th centuries, Virginia lawmakers increasingly defined slavery as racial, hereditary, and permanent. The legal status of the mother became decisive. If the mother was enslaved, the child inherited that status. Such a rule was brutally efficient. It turned birth into bookkeeping. A baby could become a future labour source before learning to focus its eyes. You can see why planters valued such laws. They transformed private domination into a self-reproducing labour force. This is where the tobacco farm becomes a family business in the grimmest sense. Not a family owning a farm, though certainly that too. A family becoming the farm's inherited labour supply. Generation follows generation under the same legal burden. Grandmother, mother, child. The crop grows, cures, and ships. The bondage remains. Sale was another route into that life. On paper, a sale could appear as a line in an account book, almost neat enough to insult the truth. One person sold with livestock, another sold to settle debt, a child listed separately, a mother sold with a notation about health or age. Estates were divided after death. Creditors pressed claims. Tobacco planting was often entangled with debt, and human beings could be shifted around to soothe the planter's financial anxiety. You begin to understand that market logic is not cool and abstract here. It arrives with names, tiers, shackles, and empty sleeping places. Hiring out created another layer of instability. A planter did not always keep every enslaved person on the same land year after year. Someone might be rented to another farmer for a term. Someone with a useful skill might be sent where labour demand was acute. This could mean working for one owner in law, another in practice, and belonging fully to neither household while being controlled by both. It was a system with all the confusion of temporary arrangement and all the cruelty of permanent power. And then there was inheritance. A child born on a Virginia tobacco farm did not need to be captured from abroad or bought at auction to enter bondage. The law did the work. By the 18th century and well into the 19th, a large proportion of black people in Virginia were American-born. That fact matters because it changes the emotional geography. For many, Virginia was not a foreign destination. It was home. Though one held in captivity, the fields were known. The rivers were known. The roads, seasons, and sounds belonged to memory. Yet belonging to the land never meant the land belonged to you. That tension runs through everything. A person could know the exact smell of pine after rain, the way red clay sticks after a storm, the sound of geese along the river in winter, and still be treated as movable property on that same landscape. You can hear the bitter joke in it. Imagine knowing every bend in a road and not being free to choose where it leads. On some farms, records show owners taking keen interest in what they called increase, meaning the rise in the enslaved population through births. The word sounds almost agricultural, as if speaking about calves or bushels. That was part of the violence. The language blurred humanity into output. Women's childbearing years could be watched with a calculating eye. Children represented future labour, future sale value, future collateral. Tender human beginnings were folded into plantation economics with astonishing coldness. Yet even here, a human life did not become an economic category in any complete way. A mother still held an infant to her chest. A father still worried over a fever. Grandparents still passed songs, nicknames, and small household wisdom across generations. Owners could claim legal rights over bodies, but they could not fully control the inner meanings people made of kinship. Virginia also served as a place from which enslaved people were sold southward in later periods, especially when the domestic slave trade expanded and demand for labour grew in the Deep South, for tobacco regions facing soil exhaustion, economic transition, or changes in crop strategy. Enslaved people could become liquid assets in the most hideous sense. To live on a Virginia farm could mean fearing not only present labour, but future removal. Being born there offered no guarantee of staying there. This produced a daily undercurrent of dread. You might wake to ordinary tasks and still wonder whether a trader's visit meant nothing or everything. Horses in the yard, a conversation held too quietly, a stranger looking people over with business-like patience. These details could stir panic before any formal announcement was made. Enslaved communities developed a keen sensitivity to signs because signs mattered. A sale rarely arrived with trumpet fanfare. It arrived in the tilt of an owner's mood. There is a scholarly debate woven through this history. Historians continue to discuss how sharply Virginia's labour systems changed from the early colonial period into the fully developed slave society of the 18th century. Some emphasize continuity and coercion. Others stress the dramatic legal and racial tightening that created a more rigid and hereditary regime. Both views illuminate something important. Coerced labour existed early. Racial slavery as an entrenched legal system became unmistakably stronger over time. That tightening did not happen by nature. It was made by policy, court rulings, custom, and profit. The ports played their part. Places along the Chesapeake connected inland farms to ocean trade. Ships carried tobacco out and goods in. Cloth, metal tools, ceramics, rum, sugar, and luxury items moved through the same networks that carried captive people and the products of their labour. The smell around these ports could be remarkable. Tar, fish, damp rope, animal waste, tobacco smoke, and salt air all mixed into one busy breath. It was commerce with a heavy moral odour. Some newly arrived Africans entered Virginia through these trading points and then faced a second dislocation inland. Imagine surviving the Atlantic only to be placed on a small boat, then a cart, then a road through forest and swamp toward an unknown farm. Trees close overhead, wheels grind over roots. insects hum. The language around you still makes no sense. You have lost home, then ocean, then shore, and now even the little orientation a port might offer. That shrinking of certainty was part of enslavement's power. Names could change too. A person brought from Africa might be assigned an English name by traders or owners. Sometimes because the original name was ignored, sometimes because it was ridiculed, sometimes because control likes to begin with renaming. To strip or alter a name is a very intimate kind of theft. And yet people often kept older names alive in private memory, in community use, or in blended naming traditions. Official identity and personal identity did not always match, which is another reminder that the written record catches only a fraction of lived truth. You also see how uneven origin shaped community life on tobacco farms. Some people had recent African memories, some were Virginia-born for generations, some spoke English fluently, some spoke other languages or carried accents that mark different beginnings. Some knew coastal rice culture, some knew inland farming systems, some knew trades, healing methods, or spiritual customs from places owners could not imagine. The quarters became a meeting ground of uprooted expertise. That expertise had practical value from the start. Agricultural knowledge did not begin in Virginia. Africans came from regions with deep experience in cultivation, seasonal timing, animal care, and plant management. Not every technique transferred neatly to tobacco, of course, since crops and climates differed, but planters benefited from a labour force capable of learning fast, adapting under pressure, and applying sophisticated environmental knowledge. There was no primitive blankness waiting to be instructed. There were human beings carrying worlds in their heads. A small but revealing detail appears in some records and later recollections. People newly arrived from Africa were sometimes described by owners as country-born or Guinea-born, labels that attempted to sort labourers by origin, language, and presumed adjustment. Such categories were crude and self-serving, but they show owners noticed differences even while flattening individuality. To them, origin mattered partly as a management problem. To the people living it, origin could mean memory, grief, and fragments of belonging. The road into bondage could also pass through violence closer to home. Free black people in some circumstances faced kidnapping. Paper protections could fail. Local prejudice could erase legal distinctions. The closer you look at the system, the less tidy its boundaries appear. Slavery depended on law, but also on opportunism, coercion, and communities willing to look away when black freedom was threatened. Once attached to a tobacco farm, the pressure to conform began quickly. Work routines, food allotments, sleeping arrangements, clothing distribution, and surveillance all aimed to absorb a person into plantation order. But absorption was never total. People tested limits, learned personalities, mapped danger, and sought allies. New arrivals might find guidance from those longer established, a warning about an overseer, a hint about where water stayed cool, advice on avoiding the worst of the midday sun. The system tore people from prior worlds, yet people still built new forms of social knowledge together. Food tells part of the story too. The provisions offered by owners were often basic and insufficient, commonly cornmeal, pork, or other cheap staples. Though quality and quantity varied, gardens, foraging, fishing, trapping, and cooking skill became vital supplements where possible. A person entering bondage in Virginia had to learn not only new labour, but new hunger. What herbs grow here? What fish can be caught in these creeks? What can be gathered from woods without attracting punishment? Even appetite had to adapt. By evening, the farm settles into a different register. Smoke rises from cabins, pots simmer, crickets begin their steady chorus. Somewhere a baby cries. Somewhere someone stares into the fire with that look people get when the body is still in one place but the mind has wandered elsewhere. Perhaps it wanders across an ocean. Perhaps only to a nearby county. Distance is distance when love is trapped under property law. So what really happened in the making of black life on Virginia tobacco farms was not a single capture followed by a single sale and a simple routine. It was an entire system of movement without consent, across water, across county lines, across inheritance records, across generations. People were delivered into tobacco through ships, statutes, debt settlements, birth, and trade. The fields did not simply fill themselves. They were supplied by a machinery of forced transfer that reached from the Atlantic world down to the cradle. The night air cools a little. Pine smoke drifts low. Frogs pulse in the dark ditches between field and wood. In a cabin doorway, someone pauses, listening to distant wheels on a road and wondering whether they will pass by or stop. The day begins with damp sleeves and a sore back. You wake before the sun has done its share of the work. The cabin still holds the stale warmth of breath, ash, and packed bodies from the night. Outside, the ground is cool for a little while, and the grass wets your ankles as you step out. The horizon carries a thin grey light. Birds call in quick bursts from the trees. Somewhere farther off, a rooster makes far too much of himself, as roosters always do. Then labour takes over. On a Virginia tobacco farm, the crop shapes the calendar with a kind of stern obsession. Tobacco was not one task, but a long chain of them, each demanding attention at the right moment. Delay could harm the plants, carelessness could reduce quality, bad timing could anger the owner and damage profit. So the day on such farms often turned around the needs of leaves that did not care whether you were tired, hungry, ill, pregnant, grieving, or 9 years old. The work started long before the field looked impressive. Seeds were tiny, almost absurdly tiny, like dark dust pinched between fingers. They were sown in prepared beds and watched carefully. Tobacco seedlings needed protection and tending before they could be transplanted. You can imagine the almost ridiculous contrast between the size of those first seeds and the scale of labour they would later demand. Wealth from a speck, misery from a speck, empire from a speck. It is a bad magic trick performed year after year. Once seedlings reached the right stage, the real strain began. The young plants had to be transplanted into the field, usually by hand, row after row, bend, press, settle the roots, move on, bend again. The body learns the motion until the motion feels like the body. Knees complain, lower backs burn, fingers become quick from repetition, though speed does not make the task gentle. The field itself has a mood. In spring it can smell fresh and raw, with turned earth, cut roots, and the faint sweetness of new growth. In summer it becomes heavy, green, and close. Heat presses down without apology. Gnats hover around your face. Flies land where sweat gathers. The leaves begin to broaden, catching light and moisture, making tunnels of thick vegetation between the rows. By midday the air can feel trapped, as if the farm has placed a lid over itself. Hoeing took a great share of time. Weeds could not be allowed to compete with tobacco for nutrients, water, or space. So workers moved through the fields with hoes, scraping, chopping, and lifting soil around the plants. Hilling strengthened the roots. Clearing weeds protected value. It also consumed hours with almost hypnotic repetition. Metal bites dirt, dirt shifts, dust rises, a person stands, moves, bends, strikes, and repeats until the body feels made of heat. This was not casual gardening. Planters often demanded precision because high-grade tobacco fetched better prices. Leaves needed careful handling, plants needed spacing, the crop responded to timing and touch. An owner who knew very little about actual labour might still bark orders as though he were an agricultural genius. The people doing the work often understood the plant more intimately than the man claiming mastery over it. Such is the confidence of ownership. It can thrive quite nicely alongside ignorance. As the plants grew, new tasks arrived. One of the most important was topping, the removal of the flowering head. This forced the plant's energy into the leaves rather than the blossom. It sounds simple enough. Pinch off the top, move along. Yet when multiplied across field after field, it became one more demand on tired hands. Then came suckering, the removal of side shoots that could weaken leaf quality. Tobacco, you discover, was endlessly needy. Every time you thought the plant had asked enough, it found another way to require your attention. Worming might have been one of the least glamorous jobs on the entire farm, which is saying something. Tobacco hornworms could wreck a crop if left unchecked, so workers searched the leaves and stems for thick green caterpillars nearly camouflaged against the plant itself. Fingers moved carefully through sticky foliage, turning leaves, spotting pests, pulling them off, crushing them, and moving on to the next plant. The work required patience and a sharp eye. It also required tolerating the strange intimacy of squishing soft, oversized garden monsters in the Virginia heat. No trumpet salutes this skill, yet without it, a field could suffer badly. Such jobs reveal the absurdity of plantation hierarchy. The owner may pose for portraits, write letters about markets, and speak of management. Meanwhile, the survival of the crop may depend on people stooped under the sun hunting insects by hand. One starts to suspect that all aristocratic confidence should be tested by assigning its owner 10 rows of hornworm duty in July. Water mattered too. Rain could bless or destroy. A dry spell threatened young plants. Too much wet could rot roots or complicate curing later. Workers learned to watch the sky with a serious eye. Clouds were not scenery. They were labour conditions. Thunder in the distance meant calculation. Will the soil soften enough for planting? Will the leaves split? Will the barn stay dry? A storm on a tobacco farm changed not only mood, but tempo. By late summer, the crop entered harvest. This was urgent work. Mature leaves had to be cut at the right stage, often in successive rounds from lower leaves upward, depending on local methods and varieties. Some farms cut whole stalks, others primed leaves in stages. Practices varied by period and place, which historians still debate in some detail. Agricultural routines were not frozen in amber. They changed over time with market demands, knowledge, climate, and local habit. But the strain of harvest remained broadly recognizable. It brought long hours, sticky hands, heavy loads, and little room for error. Cut tobacco has its own feel. Leaves are thick, limp, and strangely weighty. Sap clings to the skin. Stalks resist the knife before giving way. The smell is sharp, green, bitter, and sweet all at once. Armfuls are gathered and carried. Wagons creak under the load. Shoes slide in dirt stamped flat by constant traffic. Voices rise, not from leisure, but from haste. The crop will not wait politely while you stretch your back and admire the sunset. Then comes curing, where the leaf begins its transformation from plant to marketable product. In curing barns, tobacco was hung carefully to dry. The arrangement mattered. Airflow mattered. Moisture mattered. A leaf cured badly could lose colour, texture, and value. Barn work had its own atmosphere, dim and dusty, with beams overhead and hanging plants brushing against clothing as people moved through the narrow spaces. The smell was thick, almost edible, as if sweetness had turned darker and more serious. You could taste it in the mouth without wanting to. The labour did not end when leaves dried. After curing came stripping, sorting, and packing. Leaves were handled according to quality. Good tobacco brought better prices, so categories mattered. Workers graded, tied, and packed leaves into hogsheads or other forms for shipment. This required not only strength, but judgment. What looks sound? What feels supple? What has mould? What is too torn? What colour suggests better sale? The market sat invisibly inside these decisions, shaping fingers and eyesight from far away. Tobacco farms also depended on labour beyond the rows and barns. Fences had to be repaired, wood had to be chopped, livestock required care, water had to be drawn, cooking had to be done, laundry, mending, childcare, tool maintenance, hauling, and countless other tasks kept the whole place functioning. The romantic picture of a plantation landscape usually lingers on neat fields and a prominent house. It does not dwell on the mountain of ordinary labour required to keep anyone fed, clothed, and moving. Meals during the workday were practical, not indulgent. Food might be coarse, repetitive, and hurriedly eaten. Cornmeal preparations, salted meat when available, perhaps vegetables from provision patches, perhaps fish, perhaps almost nothing extra. The body burning through long hours in heat needed more than it often received. Hunger sat close by on many farms. So did thirst. Water breaks were not always generous, and the quality of water could vary. A tin cup of cool water in the shade might feel almost holy by afternoon. Children entered this rhythm early. Very small children might begin with lighter errands, but age brought fuller participation. A boy might carry leaves, scare birds, fetch tools, or help with animals. A girl might do the same and also take on domestic work such as minding younger children, carrying water, or helping cook. There was no clean line between child work and adult work. There was only a sliding scale of expectation, and that scale moved in one direction. Pregnancy did not stop labour either, though conditions varied. Some women worked while carrying children, sometimes deep into pregnancy, with only limited adjustment. After birth, there might be a short period of altered duties or none worth calling relief at all. Milk, exhaustion, field demands, and infant care collided in hard ways. Plantation records can describe women as workers and mothers in the same breath, while giving no sign that the combination required anything more than more effort. Night offered some relief, but not complete release. Bodies came back from the field aching in wrists, shoulders, knees, neck, and spine. Hands were nicked, stained, and roughened. Clothes smelled of smoke, sweat, earth, and leaf. Some people still had to cook, mend, or prepare for the next day before resting. The notion of a clean break between labour time and personal time belongs to worlds with more mercy in them, and yet rhythm can contain knowledge as well as pain. Workers learned the field by footstep and season. They knew which patch held water after rain. They knew where insects gathered worst. They knew how the breeze changed around the barn. They knew what the leaves felt like just before they turned. They knew the exact sound of a loaded wagon moving over packed ground. They knew which tools bruised the hands least, and which overseers could detect a slow pace from 50 yards. This was expertise born under compulsion. But it was expertise all the same. A quirky detail from tobacco labour says much about the physical reality of the crop. Green tobacco could leave workers with a sticky residue and, under certain conditions, enough nicotine exposure through wet leaves to cause dizziness or sickness. Modern researchers call this kind of illness green tobacco sickness. Earlier workers did not have the scientific label, of course, but they certainly had the nausea, headaches, and weakness that could follow prolonged contact. The plant that enriched owners could quite literally make labourers ill through the skin. Listen closely to the field and you hear more than orders. Insects drone in the heat. Leaves slap softly against one another in the breeze. A hoe rings against a buried stone. Someone clears a throat. Someone mutters under the breath. Far off, a dog barks near the yard. The soundscape of labour is not dramatic in the theatrical sense. It is repetitive, layered, and constant, which makes it all the more wearying. The ears never quite rest. Touch matters in this world. Rough hoe handles raise blisters. Sun stiffens fabric against the neck. Leaf edges brush bare skin. Sweat runs down the spine and dries to salt. Mud pulls at shoes after rain. Dust cakes the ankles in drought. A person living this rhythm comes to know the day through skin as much as sight. Morning coolness, noon blaze, evening damp. Each has its own pressure. The atmosphere around harvest time often carried tension so thick it seemed to alter the very light. Owners worried over outcomes. Overseers pushed harder. Any mistake could be noticed, commented on, or punished. Yet the crop still depended on care, no threat could manufacture out of thin air. Fear might drive speed. It could not replace skill. That was one of the quiet truths sitting in every field. Tobacco wealth relied on the judgment of people denied recognition for having judgment. By dark, the barns stand full and the rows lie in shadow. Frogs begin in the ditches. The smell of curing leaf drifts through the warm air, sweet and acrid together. Somewhere in the cabin quarters, a pot lid rattles softly. Someone lowers onto a pallet with a groan, too tired to become a complaint. Tomorrow the cycle starts again, because tobacco always wants one more thing, and on a Virginia farm, one more thing usually meant one more demand from black labouring lives. When the field finally lets go of you, another world begins. It is smaller than the grand house, darker than the barn, and much more alive than the ledgers suggest. You leave the tobacco rows behind and move toward the cabins, kitchens, yards, and narrow domestic spaces where black life on Virginia farms gathered itself together each evening. The light changes here. Firelight replaces sun. Murmured talk replaces shouted instructions. The air smells of ash, cornmeal, old wood, damp clothes, and whatever can be coaxed into supper. The quarters are not romantic. Cabins were often cramped, drafty, and built with economy in mind rather than comfort. Their size, materials, and layout varied by place and period. But many were simple one-room structures or rough dwellings split into only a few spaces. Chinks between logs might be stuffed with clay. Roofs could leak. Floors might be packed earth or rough planks. Smoke had a way of lingering inside, especially in bad weather. When doors stayed shut and the fire became both comfort and irritation, you feel every surface in such a place. A rough wall catches at the fingertips. A wool blanket scratches the skin. A stool wobbles. A pot handle burns too quickly. The air near the hearth is hot and smoky, while the far corner can still feel cold on winter nights. There is no excess space for elegance. Every object earns its place. A kettle, a spoon, a pallet, a gourd, a patched garment hanging from a peg. Even silence feels stored carefully, because walls are thin and privacy is scarce. Yet these cabins were not empty shells. They were inhabited spaces of emotion, routine, humour, conflict, longing, and craft. They held lullabies, whispered arguments, shared meals, sore feet, and private jokes. They held memories of absent people and worries about present ones. An owner looking in might have seen only labourers at rest. That would have been the shallowest possible reading of the room. The kitchen, whether inside the cabin or in a separate structure, carried its own steady drama. Food was work, fire was work, water was work. Even a plain meal required fuel, tools, timing, and attention after a day already spent on the farm. Cornmeal might be stirred into mush or baked into simple breads. Salt pork, when available, could flavour a pot. Greens, beans, squash, or gathered plants might stretch the meal. Fish from nearby creeks or rivers sometimes added much-needed variety. A garden plot, if allowed and successful, could mean the difference between bare subsistence and something closer to nourishment. Smell tells you a great deal here. Wood smoke curls through everything. Hot cornmeal has its own humble sweetness. Rendered fat turns rich and heavy in the air. Onion, if someone is lucky enough to have one, changes the whole mood of supper. Damp clothes drying near the fire add a sour edge. A sleeping child carries that warm, grassy smell children somehow produce even in hardship. The entire domestic world is scented by labour and adaptation. Women often bore a crushing share of this sphere, though men and older children also cooked, repaired, hauled, and cared depending on circumstance. Plantation fantasy liked neat divisions. Actual life was usually more practical. Whoever could mend a pot, patch a shirt, calm a child, or fetch a bucket often did. Work was too abundant for delicate theories of household elegance. Survival encouraged flexibility, even when power outside the cabin encouraged rigid hierarchy. Household goods were few, but scarcity could sharpen creativity. A broken tool might be repurposed. Worn clothing might be turned, patched, or cut down for a child. Gourd vessels could serve many uses. Old cloth became wrapping, padding, or bandaging. A bench could hold a meal, a conversation, and a sleeping body within the same day. Resourcefulness was not a charming character trait in this setting. It was a practical answer to deprivation. Domestic life also exposed one of slavery's constant contradictions. Owners wanted labourers healthy enough to work, yet often allocated shelter, clothing, and food at levels that guaranteed discomfort and instability. They wanted order, yet they pressed too many people into too little space. They wanted productivity, yet neglected the conditions that sustained bodies. This is what happens when human welfare is valued mainly as an input cost. The system behaves exactly as designed, and then acts surprised when sickness and suffering follow. Illness moved through cabin life with worrying ease. Close quarters, poor ventilation, limited medical care, and heavy labour made communities vulnerable to fever, respiratory trouble, digestive illness, injury, and exhaustion. Children were especially at risk. So were pregnant women, elders, and anyone whose body had already been worn down by fieldwork. A cough at night could keep a whole household alert. A baby running hot with fever changed the atmosphere of a room more completely than any storm. Healing often relied on a mix of methods. Some plantation owners summoned doctors for valuable workers or severe cases, though care could be delayed, crude, or shaped by economic calculation. More often, everyday illness was met first by community knowledge. Herbs, poultices, teas, steam, rest when possible, and close observation all mattered. Black women in particular often carried practical medical knowledge that owners used when convenient and ignored when arrogant, which was, naturally, quite often, white. Historians still disagree about how much of this healing knowledge can be traced directly to specific African traditions, and how much emerged from adaptation in the Americas. The record rarely offers tidy answers. What is clear is that many enslaved communities developed rich understandings of plants, symptoms, and household care. Such knowledge circulated orally, through use and through trust. You did not need a printed manual to know which leaves soothed, which roots warmed, and which teas might settle a child's stomach. The cabin also held beauty, though a hard-used kind. Hair was braided, head wraps were tied. A garment might be patched so skillfully it almost looks deliberate. Someone might carve a small object from wood. Someone might save a bright scrap of cloth because colour itself could lift the eye. People under severe control still cared about appearance. Not because vanity suddenly survives oppression, but because self-presentation is one of the quiet ways people insist on personhood. Conversation after dark carried many functions at once. It entertained, instructed, warned, and remembered. News travelled through the quarters in bits and strands. Who had been hired out? Who was ill? Which overseer was in a foul mood? What prices were rumoured? What a preacher said? What happened on a neighbouring farm? The spoken world mattered because formal power controlled so much of the written one. To talk was to knit together the social fabric under conditions that constantly threatened to tear it. Children listened to everything. They might appear drowsy by the fire, but they were learning the codes of the place. Which names were spoken carefully, which roads led where, which adults could be trusted, how to behave when the owner approached, how to read the emotional weather of a cabin. Childhood in these spaces included games, laughter, and affection, but it also included a remarkable education in vigilance. A child learned quickly that every household had ears and every yard had consequences. There were moments of play. That matters. A child could still chase another through the dirt, clap hands to a rhythm, laugh at a face pulled across the room, or treasure a carved toy. Human joy is annoyingly persistent. It appears even where systems are built to crush it. That does not make the system less cruel. It makes the people within it more fully visible. Nighttime also made room for courtship, marriage bonds, and adult affection, though all under threat. A couple might live together if circumstances allowed, or they might belong to separate owners and steal time where they could. Visits after work, permission slips, secret paths, or risky absences could all shape intimate life. Love under slavery was practical and emotional at once. It needed courage, planning, and hope, plus a tolerance for uncertainty that no one should ever be required to develop. The emotional geography of the quarters was thick with missing people, a spouse on another farm, a child sold away, a parent dead, a sibling hired out for months. Absence was not occasional here, it was structural. and yet people kept family alive in stories, names, remembered gestures, recipes, songs and warnings. Someone saying, "Your aunt used to make it this way," could hold an entire vanished world inside a simple sentence. The yards outside the cabins mattered too. These in-between spaces were places to chop wood, wash, mend, talk, watch children, shell peas, dry herbs, or simply stand for a breath of air after the crush of indoor heat. Evening sounds collected there. Crickets, frogs, distant livestock, the soft thud of an axe, a low song, a baby fussing, a laugh quickly hushed. Moonlight could flatten everything into silver and shadow, making the plain yard feel almost gentle for a few minutes. On some farms, enslaved people kept small garden plots or raised chickens when owners permitted it or found it useful. These extra resources could supplement diet, provide modest opportunities for exchange, and allow a little control over daily life. A row of beans or a patch of greens might not look dramatic, but control over even a tiny corner of production could matter deeply. To plant for your own household within a system that claimed your labour was a quiet contradiction with real emotional weight. A quirky domestic detail appears in scattered records and recollections. Clay pipes, beads, charms, homemade brooms, and tiny decorative objects sometimes turned up in or around slave quarters. These small things tell you that cabin life was not all blunt utility. People made, kept, and valued items for comfort, habit, spirituality, or personal taste. Even a simple pipe by the hearth says something. A person sat here, a person rested here, a person had a preference, a ritual, a pause. Conflict existed inside the quarters too. Overcrowding, fatigue, hunger, and fear do not produce endless harmony. People argued, children cried, tempers frayed, jealousies and resentments surfaced. That is part of the humanity of the space as well. To portray cabin life only as noble suffering would flatten it almost as badly as plantation propaganda did. These were real households under immense strain, not saints arranged around a moral lesson. The presence of the main house always hovered nearby, even when unseen. Domestic workers moved between these worlds more directly, carrying food, laundry, messages, and observations. They knew the smells of polished wood, wax, roast meat, and imported tea. They knew the sharp difference between abundance and rationing. Some slept in lofts, hallways, or outbuildings near the big house, living in an awkward borderland between surveillance and service. Such positions could bring slightly different burdens, not freedom. Inside all these spaces, time itself felt divided. Plantation time belonged to orders, labour, and the crop. Cabin time belonged more to the people within it, though never securely. Night could still be interrupted by summons, punishment, illness, storms, or the next day's dread. But within the narrow band of evening and early morning, households created a different texture of life. Food could be shared according to affection rather than command. A song could be sung for comfort instead of performance. A child could be held simply because they were loved. The fire burns lower. Someone scrapes the last of supper from the pot. Another hand twists thread through worn cloth, closing a tear by hearthlight. The smell of smoke settles into hair and blankets. Outside, dew begins to gather on the yard. A door closes. A murmur softens into sleep. In these modest cabins and kitchens, Black Virginians did not escape the tobacco system, but they made a living world inside it. One meal, one whispered story, one exhausted evening at a time. A child on a tobacco farm learns quickly that adults are often tired. You see it in the way shoulders lower at sunset, in the silence that hangs over a meal, in the careful rationing of energy even inside the cabin. Childhood unfolds in that atmosphere, where affection exists, but time is scarce and safety is never secure. On Virginia tobacco farms, black children were loved, instructed, corrected, worried over, and also drawn steadily into the labouring order that surrounded them. The first world a child knows is sensory: the smell of smoke in blankets, the sound of a spoon hitting iron, the warmth of a body beside them on a cold night, the rough feel of a wooden floor or packed earth under bare feet, the way dew wets the grass outside at dawn, the hum of insects in summer, the rhythm of adult voices speaking softly after work, sometimes laughing, sometimes whispering names with sudden seriousness. Long before a child understands law or commerce, they understand atmosphere. Infancy itself unfolded under conditions of strain. Mothers might nurse while managing field labour, household work, or both. Other women often helped care for infants, whether as kin, neighbours, or older girls assigned to mind children. Care was collective when it had to be, and it often had to be. A crying baby could not wait for the fantasy of perfect circumstances. Someone had to rock, sing, carry, feed, clean, and soothe. Cradles and pallets in the quarters did not create a separate nursery world. Babies slept in the same smoky, crowded spaces where meals were cooked, clothes were mended, and tired adults argued in low tones. Children grew up hearing work discussed as naturally as weather. They also grew up sensing danger before they could name it. A sudden knock at the door, a raised voice from outside, a parent growing tense at the sight of a stranger. Such things entered the body early. Names mattered in childhood. A child could carry a formal name known to owners and a nickname used in the quarters, warm with family meaning. Sometimes names recalled elders, absent relatives, or biblical figures. Sometimes they carried hope, humour, or simple familiarity. In a world that often reduced children to future labour value, naming remained one of the first acts of intimate recognition. You are this person. You belong among these people. You are known. Young children were not necessarily put to full labour at once, but idleness was seldom an option for long. Very small tasks arrived early. Gathering chips for the fire, carrying a gourd of water, watching a younger child for a few minutes, scaring birds from a garden patch, fetching a dropped tool, holding something steady while an adult worked. These chores might seem ordinary, and in one sense they were. What made them different was the environment of coercion surrounding them. By the time children grew older, tasks often expanded sharply. Boys and girls alike might be sent into the fields for lighter work at first, then heavier labour as their bodies strengthened. Some learned to pick worms from tobacco leaves, carry bundles, pull weeds, or assist in planting and harvesting. Others took on domestic work such as sweeping, washing, helping cook, spinning, or caring for smaller children. Childhood was not erased in one dramatic moment. It was gradually crowded out. A child notices fairness long before history does. One of the quiet sorrows of plantation childhood is how early comparison enters the mind. Why does one child wear shoes and another not? Why does one table overflow while another goes thin by the end of the week? Why may one child play in the yard while another carries water? The big house and the quarters did not sit far apart in many cases. Physical nearness made inequality visible. A child did not need formal politics to perceive insult. At the same time, children found ways to play, because the urge to play survives in almost any human setting. Games could emerge from clapping rhythms, chasing, singing, mock contests, balancing feats, handmade toys, riddles, and nonsense songs. A stick might become a horse, a carved doll might become a treasure. Pebbles, bones, scraps of cloth, and seed pods could all be transformed by imagination. It is one of the stubborn facts of human life that delight keeps breaking through where no one invited it. Adults often use stories to teach children how to move through a dangerous world. Some lessons were direct. Do not go there. Do not answer that man unless spoken to twice. Do not repeat what you hear in this room. Others came wrapped in tales, jokes, warnings, and moral examples. Storytelling served entertainment, memory, and instruction all at once. A child learned who could be trusted, what behaviour drew punishment, and how to read the moods of those in power. There was also tenderness, a hand smoothing a child's hair, a bit of extra food quietly slipped into small fingers, a song hummed in the dark, A baby bounced on a knee while an elder pretends not to smile too much. These moments mattered because they were not abstract. They told children that they were wanted, that they belonged, that someone's affection could still reach them even under the heavy machinery of the farm. Yet childhood on these farms was shadowed by sale and separation. A child might see a sibling disappear from daily life. A mother might tense every time an owner discussed accounts. A father working on another property might visit irregularly or not at all. Families did everything possible to bind children emotionally to kin, but the legal system offered no guarantee that kin would remain near. This uncertainty pressed itself into childhood memory with cruel force. Some children likely knew the geography of fear in practical terms. Which road traders used? What kind of wagon meant ordinary hauling and what kind might mean something worse? Which conversations made adults lower their voices? You can imagine a child listening from a corner half pretending to sleep, while the older people discuss rumours in tones too careful to ignore. Children are often sharper observers than adults give them credit for. On a farm, that sharpness could become a survival skill. Religious life shaped childhood too. Some children were taught prayers, Bible stories, hymns, or spiritual songs, whether through parents, elders, itinerant preachers, or plantation-sponsored instruction. Such teaching could carry comfort, discipline, and hope. At the same time, religious language introduced children to questions of justice very early. Why should some suffer and others command? Why does God see everyone, yet allow some people to own others? Children do not always ask these aloud. They still ask them. Scholars continue to debate how much room enslaved children had for a distinct childhood, separate from labour expectations. The answer seems to vary by age, region, owner, and household conditions. Some children may have had a few more years of play and light chores. Others likely entered serious work very young. The category of childhood existed, but it was narrowed, interrupted, and bent toward usefulness. The farm respected growth mainly because growth meant future labour. Older girls often carried especially complicated burdens. They might help mind infants, fetch water, cook, wash, patch clothing, and enter field labour too. Their training was practical, but it also drew them early into responsibilities that looked suspiciously like adulthood in miniature. Older boys, meanwhile, were increasingly pushed toward harder agricultural work, animal care, hauling, or learning trades if the farm required it, gender-shaped labour, but not always in neat or gentle ways. A quirky detail appears in some accounts of plantation childhood across the American South, including Virginia. Children sometimes use corn cobs, nutshells, rag bundles, or carved scraps as toys. Such objects may sound painfully simple to modern ears, but they reveal something important. Play did not wait for purchased things. It grew from whatever the world offered. A toy made from scraps is also evidence of an observing mind and a making hand. Even scarcity could not fully starve imagination. Schooling in the formal sense and was largely denied. Literacy among enslaved people was feared by many owners because reading and writing could widen thought, communication, and resistance. Some children may have picked up letters secretly, learned from white children, absorbed scraps from religious instruction, or been taught in hidden ways by literate black or white individuals. But systematic education was not something the plantation order wished to encourage. A child asking what the marks on a page mean could, under slavery, become a dangerous little person, so knowledge travelled differently, through memory, through demonstration, through repeated sayings, through songs that fixed words in the mind. Through watching adults with near-scientific attention, a child learned how to tie, carry, stir, sweep, plant, soothe, detect mood, and avoid risk partly by being near those who already knew. It was an education of observation, imitation, and correction, conducted under circumstances no child deserved. Punishment touched childhood too. A child might be whipped, slapped, confined, threatened, or denied food or rest, depending on the owner or overseer, some adults in bondage, desperate to protect children from harsher punishment, disciplined them first within the quarters. That created painful contradictions. Liv could carry a stern hand because the world outside the cabin carried a worse one. It is hard to imagine a crueler system than one that teaches parents to fear for their children every hour and then judges their responses from a distance. The emotional lives of children could be rich even under such pressure. They formed attachments, rivalries, favourites, and fears. They admired older siblings. They annoyed exhausted adults. They learned songs by heart. They carried secret treasures in pockets. They asked inconvenient questions. They cried over things grown-ups dismissed and accepted things grown-ups found unbearable. Childhood does not become less real because the setting is unjust. It becomes more urgent to notice. You can picture the end of a long day. The sky turns violet over the fields. Smoke drifts low from several cabins at once. A small child nods off against an aunt's shoulder while a pot simmers nearby. Another child traces shapes in the dirt with a stick. Somewhere 2 older children clap out a rhythm and laugh. A baby wakes and protests with fierce sincerity. An elder begins a story, and for a few minutes the room belongs not to the plantation, but to the people in it. That room still holds worry. Shoes to mend, food to stretch, a fever to watch, a daughter getting old enough to draw unwelcome notice, a son getting big enough for harder labour. But it also holds fierce attentiveness. Adults on Virginia tobacco farms could not always protect children from the system. They could still teach, comfort, prepare, and love them inside it. So what really happened to children in this world was not merely that they worked young, though many did. It was that childhood itself became a contested space. The farm wanted usefulness. Families insisted on humanity. The farm measured growth in labour capacity. Families measured it in teeth coming through, songs remembered, heights marked on a wall, and names passed carefully from one generation to the next, somewhere between smoke, soil, and supervision. Black children learn to become themselves in a place determined to claim them first. Night settles softly outside. Crickets carry on as if the world were simple. A child turns in sleep on a narrow pallet. An older hand reaches over to pull a blanket higher. The gesture lasts only a second. It says everything. Power on a tobacco farm was meant to be visible. It stood in the posture of the owner, in the sharp voice of the overseer, in the crack of a whip kept not only for use but for display, and in the laws that sat behind every order like a second and colder weapon. On Virginia tobacco farms, control was not left to chance. It was built into daily routine, reinforced by punishment, and wrapped in a constant atmosphere of warning. You feel the atmosphere before anything dramatic happens. A person glances up too quickly when footsteps approach. Conversation lowers when a white figure crosses the yard. Bodies in the field adjust pace because they sense inspection. Even a quiet farm can carry tension like a low current underwater. It does not need shouting every minute. People know the consequences are available. That knowledge alone does much of the work. The owner might present himself as a paternal guardian, a civil gentleman, even a Christian benefactor. Plantation records and letters are full of men praising their own moderation. Human beings do adore flattering memoirs. Yet the structure beneath such language remains simple. One person claimed the legal right to command the life, labour, movement, and often bodily safety of another. Any softness in manner existed within that hard fact, not outside it. Overseers and drivers turned authority into daily enforcement. The overseer, usually a hired white manager on larger operations, was expected to keep work moving, report disobedience, and protect the owner's profits. He could be measured by crop output and labour discipline. That created incentives for cruelty. A decent overseer was not impossible, but the position itself was built around extraction. Some men took to it with nasty enthusiasm. Others carried out its tasks with ordinary coldness, which may be worse in its own way. Drivers occupied a narrower and more painful role. Usually enslaved men placed in positions of responsibility over field gangs. They were expected to organise labour, relay commands, and maintain pace. Such status could bring slightly better treatment or strategic importance, but it also placed them under tremendous pressure from both directions. They could be blamed by owners for weak output, and distrusted by fellow workers for participating in discipline. There was no clean moral comfort in such a position, only difficult choices inside an immoral structure. Punishment took many forms. The whip remains the most notorious because it was widespread, theatrical, and physically devastating. It could be used for alleged laziness, disobedience, absence, theft, damage, insolence, or any behaviour an owner wished to frame as a challenge. The point was not merely pain, it was demonstration. A whipping instructed the surrounding community as much as the person struck. It said, "This is what the hierarchy can do." The body learned to read signs of danger, a certain tone in the overseer's voice. A pause before a command repeated, the sound of boots in mud outside a cabin at the wrong hour, the silence of the yard after someone is called to the house. These details could set nerves on edge long before punishment became visible. Fear often works best as anticipation. The imagination begins the suffering early. Whipping was not the only method. People could be threatened with sale, confined, deprived of food, placed in irons, assigned heavier labour, separated from loved ones, or subjected to public humiliation. Women as well as men suffered punishment, though planters and records often described female punishment differently, sometimes with a hypocritical concern for appearances that changed very little in practice. Children, too, could be disciplined physically or terrorised into obedience. Power did not confine itself to one age or one sex. Law gave this violence a polished outer shell. Virginia statutes over generations defined who could be enslaved, what punishments could be imposed, how movement was restricted, and how little legal recourse black people possessed against white authority. Courts generally protected property rights, not enslaved bodies. A person could be beaten and still find the law more interested in whether valuable property had been damaged than whether a human being had suffered. It is one of those situations where legality does not soften evil at all. It merely organises it. Movement was watched closely. Passes might be required to leave the farm. Roads were dangerous spaces because patrols, neighbours, and strangers could challenge black people travelling without obvious permission. Night travel especially raised suspicion. This mattered because control of movement meant control of family, worship, trade, news, and escape. To decide who may walk where is to govern much more than distance. Surveillance happened through architecture as well as rules. Cabins might be placed where the main house or overseer's dwelling could observe the quarters. Work gangs were arranged for visibility. Barns, roads, gates, and yards all formed part of the monitoring landscape, even when direct watching was absent. People knew they might be observed at any time. That possibility could shrink behaviour in subtle ways. One lowers the voice, one delays a visit, one hides an object more carefully, one teaches a child never to repeat certain words. Yet surveillance was never complete. People still found ways to pass news, meet, grieve, and create private meanings inside public routine. The existence of punishment does not prove total control. In fact, the constant need for punishment often reveals the opposite. Owners and overseers had to keep threatening because enslaved people remained thinking, feeling, choosing beings, never perfectly transformed into obedient tools. Owners also used reward, which can be another face of coercion: extra rations, a holiday, a small garden plot, permission to visit family, tobacco for personal use, or comparatively lighter work could be granted as incentives. Such measures did not cancel bondage. They refined it. A system that alternates pressure with selective favour can bind people tightly, because it turns ordinary human hopes into leverage. One begins to see how even kindness, in such a setting, could become a management tactic. The emotional texture of punishment extended beyond the person directly targeted. A mother hearing her child cry out, a husband seeing his wife dragged into public shame, a group forced to witness what happens when someone is accused of slowness or theft. These experiences lodged in memory, altering behaviour for days or years. Violence on plantations spread through communities like weather. Even those not struck felt its temperature. There is also the problem of records. Planters often underreported their own brutality, used euphemisms, or wrote as if punishment were a reluctant necessity brought on by the faults of the enslaved. Later apologists inherited that language and polished it further. Historians still argue over how discipline varied across regions, owners, and time periods, especially on smaller farms where close contact might coexist with severe violence. Variation existed, certainly, but variation should not be mistaken for safety. A farm could lack constant spectacular brutality and still remain built on coercion from foundation to roof. A quirky but revealing element of plantation discipline is just how often ordinary tools became instruments of threat. The same rope that tied loads, the same iron that fixed equipment, the same shed used for storage could be repurposed into punishment or confinement. On such farms, daily objects carried a double meaning: practical by daylight, menacing by memory. A person could look at a post in the yard and know far more about it than a visitor ever would. Religion was sometimes recruited into control as well. Owners or preachers might emphasize obedience, patience, and heavenly reward, hoping to quiet earthly resistance. Selected Bible passages were favored for obvious reasons. Yet ideas do not always stay where power places them. Enslaved listeners also heard stories of deliverance, judgment, and divine concern for the oppressed. The same text an owner used to demand submission could nourish a very different imagination in the quarters. Fear on these farms was not always loud. Sometimes it was administrative. A name entered in a ledger, a pass denied, a ration reduced, a complaint believed because it came from a white mouth, a marriage treated as irrelevant, a child valued in dollars. Such quiet actions could shape life as forcefully as any whip. Bureaucracy, after all, is often violence wearing cleaner sleeves. And still, people studied the people above them. Which overseer could be persuaded by steady work? Which owner was vain enough to be manipulated by flattery? Which mistress watched household tasks with nervous precision? Which patroller drank too much? Power did not flow only downward. Information flowed upward too, in the sense that enslaved communities learned the habits of those who controlled them and used that knowledge where possible. Survival required close reading. Dogs could play a role in enforcement, especially in tracking or intimidation. Horses, too, by giving patrollers mobility and symbolic height. The sounds of enforcement had their own vocabulary. Hoofbeats after dark, harness chains, a latch thrown open too fast. The peculiar silence that falls when everyone nearby knows someone is in trouble. These sounds could stir dread more effectively than direct speech. There were moments when punishment crossed into extreme brutality, and those moments should not be softened. Enslaved people could be maimed, terrorized, sexually abused, sold away, or driven beyond endurance. Not every farm, not every day, not every owner in the same pattern. But the possibility was real and near enough to shape behavior. A person living under slavery did not need to endure the maximum horror daily to know that the system permitted it. At the same time, control was often negotiated in tiny acts. A worker moves just fast enough. A domestic servant answers with respectful words and private contempt. A parent trains a child to appear compliant while noticing everything. People learned to survive inside contradiction. One could perform submission without granting inward consent. One could endure fear without losing all judgment. Night made authority feel both weaker and stranger. The yard darkened. The fields became shadow. The big house windows glowed like watchful eyes. In the quarters, voices dropped lower. Some fears sharpened after sunset because patrols moved and punishments could arrive suddenly. Yet darkness also blurred boundaries, carried whispers farther, and reminded everyone that even owners had to sleep eventually. The plantation liked daylight, because daylight displayed order. Night belonged more ambiguously to everyone. What really happened on Virginia tobacco farms was not simply that punishments occurred, it was that an entire culture of domination surrounded labor every hour. Law, surveillance, threat, reward, distance, architecture, and physical violence all work together to produce obedience or something close enough to sell as obedience. But even inside that tight web, enslaved people remained active minds. They feared, calculated, protected one another, concealed things, performed roles, and searched constantly for usable space inside coercion. The air cools as the last light fades. Somewhere a dog gives one sharp bark, then another. A cabin door closes carefully. Footsteps pass across the yard, slow and measured. In the dark, power is still present, but so is watchfulness from below, patient and alert, refusing to disappear. The plantation liked to pretend skill lived at the top, in portraits, letters, and account books. The owner appears as planner, manager, and master of outcomes. He surveys fields, discusses prices, and congratulates himself on prudence. It is a flattering little theatre, but step onto a Virginia tobacco farm and the illusion begins to wobble. Much of the knowledge that kept the place alive lived in black hands, black memories, black observation, and black judgment. You see it first in the crop itself. Tobacco is not a plant that rewards carelessness for long. It reacts to weather, soil condition, pests, moisture, timing, and handling with relentless honesty. Leaves yellow too soon. Worms bite through profit. Mold creeps into curing barns. Stalks weaken. Quality falls. A man can own 1,000 acres and still fail if the people working them do not understand what the plants require. That is one of the quiet facts buried inside plantation wealth. Expertise and authority were not the same thing. Field hands were rarely unskilled bodies moving on command. Many knew exactly how to judge seedbeds, how deep to set young plants, how to hill soil around roots, how to read insect damage, and how to decide whether a leaf was ready for cutting. Such judgments were learned through years of repetition, observation, and correction. A person who has worked tobacco long enough can notice problems in colour, smell, texture, and leaf posture that would escape a casual eye. That knowledge is technical. Even if no one hangs a diploma over the cabin wall, there is a practical intelligence in farming that often goes unnoticed by people who have never depended on a crop. You learn to read ski and soil together. You learn what yesterday's rain means for today's work. You learn how clay feels different underfoot before a storm. You learn which slope dries first and which low patch holds too much damp. On a Virginia farm, enslaved workers carried that environmental awareness in their bodies. It was not theory, it was survival plus production. The curing barn demanded another layer of expertise. Once tobacco was cut, everything about handling mattered. Leaves had to be arranged, hung, dried, and protected with attention that bordered on obsession. Too much moisture invited rot. Too little and the leaf became brittle. The barn had to breathe correctly, air needed to move, but not recklessly. A worker entering such a space could often tell by smell alone whether the crop was curing well. The nose knew before the ledger did. Sorting required its own trained eye. Colour, texture, size, tears, and flexibility all affected quality. Bundling and packing were not just brute tasks. They involved classification, consistency, and care in preparing tobacco for market. A well-packed hogshead could protect value during storage and shipment. A poor one could invite damage and complaint. The owner might take credit for a successful sale. But those results rested on many prior acts of skilled labour by people denied equal recognition for possessing skill. Some black workers also served as carpenters, coopers, blacksmiths, wheelwrights, boatmen, brickmakers, or stock tenders. Tobacco farms needed fences, barrels, wagons, tools, sheds, hinges, repaired wheels, and sound buildings. A cooper's work alone mattered enormously, because barrels and casks stood at the intersection of storage, transport, and sale. Poor coopering could leak money almost literally. A blacksmith who could shape iron, mend tools, and keep equipment functioning held the farm together in ways no decorative plantation rhetoric could replace. Craft knowledge carried status of a complicated sort. Skilled enslaved artisans might be hired out for profit, trusted with more independent tasks, or given responsibilities that made them especially valuable to owners. Yet value was a dangerous gift under slavery. To be useful could mean slightly better material conditions, but it could also mean heavier expectation, closer surveillance, or the constant threat of sale to someone eager to purchase that very usefulness. Being prized as a worker did not mean being respected as a person. Women's expertise was equally vital, though often disguised as ordinary duty. Black women on tobacco farms knew food preservation, cooking under scarcity, childcare, nursing, herbal treatment, textile repair, and often field work at a high level besides. The plantation system had a habit of describing such labour as natural, which is a convenient word people use when they want skill without acknowledgement. There is nothing natural about feeding many mouths with meagre provisions, managing illness in close quarters, and stretching worn fabric through another season. That is trained judgment under pressure. Midwifery and healing deserve special attention. In many enslaved communities, certain women became known for assisting births, reading symptoms, preparing remedies, and caring for the sick. On farms where formal medical care was distant, expensive, or indifferent, these women could become essential figures in everyday survival. Owners sometimes relied on them deeply, while still refusing to recognize their authority in any lasting way. Plantation society was wonderfully talented at dependence without respect. There is scholarly uncertainty around how much specific agricultural knowledge on Virginia tobacco farms can be traced to African precedents, because tobacco itself was indigenous to the Americas and plantation labour systems changed over time. Historians continue to debate the precise lines of transmission. What can be said with confidence is that enslaved Africans and African Americans brought broad experience in cultivation, adaptation, timing, and environmental reading, then built further expertise under local conditions. Knowledge did not arrive complete. It developed in conversation with land, necessity, and repeated labour. Children absorbed skill gradually. A boy watching an older hand sort leaves. A girl learning how long to keep a pot near the fire. A teenager noticing which horse favoured one leg. A younger child learning which weeds belonged in supper and which belonged nowhere near a mouth. Teaching often happened sideways, in demonstration and correction, rather than formal lessons. One person watches, another tries. An elder clicks the tongue, takes the tool, and shows the motion again. That is education, whether the plantation called it that or not. A quirky but telling detail emerges in some records of agricultural labour. Owners occasionally complained that a newly purchased enslaved person was not yet fit for tobacco work, as though skilled labour might somehow bloom automatically from being ordered around. The complaint reveals more than the owner intended. It shows that tobacco farming required training. It also shows a delightful level of planter self-importance, because many such men seemed offended to discover that expertise could not be purchased pre-installed like a brass lock. Drivers often needed managerial knowledge too. However morally fraught their position, they might be expected to distribute tasks, judge pace, recognize weak plants, handle tools, report progress, and navigate the moods of both workers and overseers. Their role illustrates how power on a plantation did not erase black competence. Instead, it appropriated it, pressed it into service, and then blamed it when outcomes disappointed. The natural world around the farm also became a field of practical mastery. People knew where to gather berries, nuts, roots, medicinal plants, reeds, or firewood. They knew which creek bends yielded fish, which trees split best for fuel, and which seasons offered certain opportunities. Such knowledge did not only ease hardship, it widened the sense of possible action beyond the owner's official inventory. A landscape never belongs entirely to the person who holds the deed. It also belongs, in lived detail, to those who know how to move through it. Music and rhythm could be forms of expertise as well. Work songs, calls, and shared rhythms helped pace effort, coordinate movement, and carry emotion through labour. A synchronized task often goes better. A repeated line can steady the breath. A beat tapped on wood or clap struck in the right moment can organise bodies across a yard or field. Outsiders might hear entertainment. The people making it often heard timing, encouragement, and shared understanding. Cooking, too, was knowledge of extraordinary sophistication. Turning limited ingredients into sustaining meals requires memory, experimentation, and sensory precision. How much salt remains, how long to simmer greens, when cornmeal is thick enough, which fish needs what handling, which herbs mask staleness, what can be saved for morning. Such kitchen decisions shaped health and morale in ways that ledgers never measured. The farm depended as much on spoon wisdom as on field hose. Some enslaved people on Virginia farms developed reputations that travelled. A man known as an excellent carpenter might be borrowed by neighbours. A woman known for healing might be sought quietly across property lines. A trusted boatman might transport goods along local waters. These reputations mattered because they created forms of esteem inside the black community and functional value in the eyes of owners. Still, esteem and security were not the same. A skilled person remained vulnerable to sale, punishment, fatigue, and grief like anyone else. The great insult of slavery was not only that it stole labour, it also stole credit. Owners accepted praise for prosperous farms built by enslaved expertise. Visitors admired order in the barns, quality in the tobacco, neatness in the fences, and abundance in the kitchen, while assuming these things radiated naturally from white management. The actual makers often remained unnamed. That is why so much of this history must be read carefully. Achievement is present, but signatures are missing. Touch reveals skill in this world more clearly than speeches do. A practiced hand ties a bundle with clean speed. Fingers test a leaf and know whether it will tear. A palm rests briefly on a child's forehead and detects fever. A cook stirs by feel, not measurement. A carpenter judges a board by grain and weight. These are not random motions. They are embodied knowledge, repeated until action becomes almost musical. Weather sharpened such skill constantly. A sudden rain might require hurried shifts in labour and storage. A cold spell could threaten seedlings. A humid stretch might complicate curing. People on the ground adapted in real time. They adjusted tasks, altered handling, and watched materials change hour by hour. The person writing letters in the main house might later describe the season. The people in the barns and fields had already lived it through their skin. There was pride in skilled work, even under coercion, not the pride of serving the plantation, but the pride of competence, of doing something well because you know how. A straight fence line, a healthy patch of plants, a successful birth, a good meal, a sound barrel, a healed child, a neatly mended shirt. These things could hold emotional meaning independent of the owner's profit. Skill allowed people to claim excellence in a world eager to deny them every honourable quality. At dusk the farm grows quieter, and some of that hidden authority becomes easier to sense. A repaired wheel stands ready for morning. Tobacco hangs correctly in the barn. Supper fills the room with steam. A fever eases under careful hands. The owner may sleep believing his estate runs on command. The truth is less flattering and far more interesting. Virginia tobacco farms ran on black intelligence, black attention, and black skill so deeply woven into daily life that the whole place would have come apart without it. Resistance on a tobacco farm rarely announced itself with drums. That is part of what made it so difficult for owners to fully crush. Grand rebellions did occur in the long history of slavery, but daily life in Virginia often produced quieter forms of refusal, harder to detect and impossible to eliminate completely. On tobacco farms, black Americans resisted in gestures small enough to pass through a doorway, subtle enough to hide in routine, and dangerous enough to matter. You begin by noticing pace. A task can be done. It can be done well. It can also be done a little more slowly than the overseer wants, especially when the overseer has made himself especially unbearable. On plantations, time belonged officially to the owner, but enslaved workers could still shape the rhythm of labour within narrow margins. A pause at the end of a row, a longer look at a plant than strictly required, a trip to fetch water that takes just enough time to count as human rather than machine. Such acts might seem tiny, yet they chipped at the fantasy of perfect control. Feigning illness was another tactic. though a risky one. Bodies on these farms were genuinely overworked, so the line between actual sickness and strategic weakness could blur. A person might emphasize symptoms, limp more noticeably, move with extra heaviness, or use the known language of complaint to gain a little relief. It was not laziness, it was negotiation under force. When your labour is claimed by others, control over your own body becomes one of the few currencies left. Tools could resist too. A hoe goes missing, a blade dulls more quickly than expected, a harness strap breaks, a wagon pin is not where it should be. Not every broken object signals sabotage. Of course, farms are hard on equipment, yet plantation records and complaints sometimes carry a suspicious irritation that reveals how often owners feared intentional damage. They were not foolish to fear it. A system built on coercion should expect, as a matter of common sense, that the coerced will occasionally make life difficult. Food was a site of resistance in quiet ways. A little extra from the garden kept for one's own household rather than offered up. Fish caught after dark, fruit gathered from the edge of the woods, a chicken quietly fattened when someone with power was not paying close attention. Theft from the plantation storehouse or kitchen could also occur, though from the perspective of the enslaved, taking food from a system that underfed you might feel less like theft and more like arithmetic correction. Movement after dark carried its own rebellious possibilities. Visiting a spouse on another farm without permission, attending a secret gathering, slipping off to exchange goods, or simply walking beyond sanctioned space could all count as defiance. The roads and paths of Virginia did not belong solely to owners, no matter how much law tried to support that illusion. Enslaved people mapped those routes in lived detail. They knew where brush thickened, where creeks muffled sound, where patrols rode most often, and which houses might quietly help. Meetings in hidden places were especially important. In woods, clearings, cabins, and other sheltered corners, people could pray, sing, share news, grieve, and plan without the same level of plantation supervision. These gatherings were social and spiritual at once. They preserved community. They also built trust, and trust is one of the great enemies of every oppressive system. When people speak honestly together, power loses some of its fog. Song could carry resistance in plain hearing. A tune might sound harmless to an owner and mean something richer to the people singing it. Rhythm could steady labour. Lyrics could veil commentary, longing, warning, or faith. Voice itself became a kind of space that owners could hear but not always fully enter. There is something rather satisfying in that. The plantation can count bodies, tools, and hogsheads. It still cannot fully inventory what a song means to the singer. Religion, too, offered a language that could undermine bondage even when owners hoped to use it for obedience. Stories of deliverance, judgment, and divine justice resonated powerfully among the enslaved. To believe that earthly power was not ultimate could itself be an act of resistance. Prayer meetings beyond white supervision especially worried owners because they combined spiritual strength with private assembly. They were right to worry. Hope shared in a circle of trusted people is politically dangerous. Family loyalty pushed back against the system constantly. Owners wanted labour, families wanted one another. A parent teaching a child family names, warning signs, and household memory was resisting the plantation's effort to define identity from above. A spouse travelling secretly for a visit was resisting the geography of control. An elder insisting that a sold-away relative still be spoken of by name was resisting the market's attempt to turn disappearance into silence. Learning could also be rebellious. Reading and writing were often forbidden or discouraged. But when enslaved people gained literacy, even in fragments, the possibilities expanded. A written past could be forged. A Bible verse could be interpreted independently. A letter could travel. A scrap of newspaper could reveal a wider world. Literacy was feared because it made thought harder to fence. Even oral knowledge had similar force. News about politics, war, law, rumours of freedom, and events on neighbouring farms circulated through black networks with impressive speed. Historians continue to debate the scale and organisation of resistance on smaller Virginia farms compared with larger plantations. The evidence can be patchy because successful everyday resistance often left little direct record, while owners recorded only what they noticed or wished to emphasise. What remains clear is that resistance should not be measured solely by open revolt, delay, concealment, evasion, theft, flight, religious gathering, family preservation, and the defence of private thought all belong to the landscape of opposition. Flight was the boldest option and among the most dangerous. To run away from a tobacco farm required nerve, planning, and luck. A person needed knowledge of roads, swamps, safe houses, food sources, and patrol patterns. Advertisements for runaways from Virginia reveal how often owners face this challenge. They listed clothing, scars, speech, skills, possible destinations, and suspected relatives, all in hopes of recapture. Such ads are chilling, but they also testify to determination. People kept leaving when they could. Not everyone ran far. Some ran briefly to punish an owner with inconvenience, to visit loved ones, to seek temporary refuge, or to force negotiation. Others aimed for towns, ships, free black community, or northern destinations. Some joined maroon-like hiding places in swamps or woodlands for a time. Each path carried risk, dogs, patrols, rewards, weather, and betrayal all threatened escape. Still, the existence of these attempts says something vital. The enslaved did not mistake their condition for natural. Women resisted in forms that are sometimes harder to see in records shaped by men. They could conceal food, slow household labour, preserve forbidden ties, protect children's knowledge, exchange information, and maintain spaces of community under intense surveillance. They could also answer back, refuse sexual exploitation where possible, and use feigned compliance as a shield. Plantation records often rendered such actions invisible or translated them into the insulting language of insolence. Yet the work of preserving human dignity inside domestic spaces was itself resistance. A quirky but revealing detail appears in accounts from various slaveholding regions, including Virginia. Some enslaved people used seemingly innocent objects such as quilts, baskets, walking sticks, or hair arrangements to signal practical information within trusted circles. Historians remain cautious about sweeping claims concerning elaborate secret codes, and rightly so. Still, it is entirely plausible that ordinary items carried private meanings in local contexts. Oppressed people become inventive. That is one of history's most reliable patterns. Resistance could live in memory too. Keeping African names, sayings, rhythms, foodways, or burial customs alive where possible was not nostalgia alone. It challenged the plantation's wish to define the enslaved as people without pasts. Likewise, creating new black identities rooted in Virginia, kinship, and shared struggle, challenged the owner's claim to total authorship over enslaved lives. To remember differently is to resist being narrated by power. Humour had its place as well. Gentle sarcasm, mimicry, sly nicknames, exaggerated politeness, and private laughter about white foolishness all helped puncture the authority owners tried to stage. You can almost hear it. A pompous planter misjudges the weather, boasts about his wisdom, and gets quietly mocked for 3 evenings in a row once he's out of earshot. Laughter does not topple a regime. It does keep the regime from owning the whole emotional landscape. Some acts of resistance were costly. A person caught stealing, running, meeting secretly, or speaking too boldly could be whipped, sold, shackled, or worse. That danger gives weight to even the smallest defiant act. It is easy from a comfortable distance to praise dramatic courage and overlook modest disobedience. But on a tobacco farm, refusing complete surrender of will might mean something as simple as keeping a little food hidden, holding a forbidden meeting, teaching a child a family story, or keeping one's true opinion unspoken and intact. Resistance also took the form of care, tending the sick carefully when the owner would not, passing on remedies, helping a runaway with provisions, watching another person's child, sharing tools, scraps, seeds, or warning. These acts built a moral community that ran alongside the plantation economy without belonging to it. The owner could command labour, but he could not fully command generosity. That remained in the hands of the people. The woods at night feel different from the yard. Pine needles soften footsteps. The air smells cleaner there, cooler, touched by damp earth and leaves rather than barn smoke. Crickets pulse. Somewhere an owl gives one patient note. In such spaces, away from direct observation, people could speak more freely, sing more fully, and let the body hold itself with less caution. That, too, was resistance. Not only fighting power, but stepping outside it long enough to remember another way of being. What really happened on Virginia tobacco farms was not passive endurance from dawn to dark. Endurance was part of it. Yes, but so was refusal. Refusal bent into shapes the system could not always see. Slow work, hidden food, secret meetings, quiet mockery, dangerous travel, family loyalty, prayer with teeth in it. Resistance was not always loud, but it was present, persistent, and woven through daily life like roots under hard ground. By the time tobacco leaves reached a distant pipe, much of the truth had already been polished away. That is how profitable myths often work. The farther money travels from suffering, the cleaner it likes to appear. Virginia tobacco became one of the great engines of colonial and early American wealth, feeding merchants, creditors, shippers, insurers, shopkeepers, politicians, and gentlemen with ambitious waistcoats. Yet the public story that emerged around this wealth often turned the plantation into a stage set. All order, gentility, and noble stewardship. It was a very elegant lie. You can see why the lie appealed. A broad house on a rise, fields rippling in the sun, wagons moving steadily, well-dressed owners discussing quality and trade, ships waiting on the river. The scene flatters everyone who profits from it. It suggests a natural harmony between land, labour, and leadership. It leaves out the surveillance, the hunger, the sale of children, the smoke in the cabins, and the fact that black labourers understood the crop better than the men signing export papers. Tobacco shaped Virginia with remarkable force. It influenced land use, labour systems, trade routes, social hierarchy, and political power. Planting tobacco encouraged expansion onto new land because the crop exhausted soil over time when grown intensively. Planters sought fresh acreage, and that search fed the seizure of indigenous land, the spread of slavery, and a culture in which owning land and people became central to status. You begin to see tobacco not as a mere product, but as an organising obsession. The market rewarded image as much as substance. Planters wanted to present themselves as refined producers of valuable goods, tied to Atlantic commerce and respectable society. Letters about quality, barrels, shipment, and prices could sound almost civilized in their tidy confidence. Meanwhile, the actual production process was muddy, exhausting, and coercive. Markets are wonderful at making ugliness legible as elegance once it has been converted into exchange value. Virginia's elite used tobacco wealth to build political influence. Men connected to plantation interests helped shape colonial assemblies, local courts, militia structures, and later state politics. A farm was never just a farm in this world. It was a source of votes, debts, marriages, alliances, credit, and office. The tobacco landscape produced not only crops, but ruling classes, and those ruling classes naturally preferred a story in which their authority seemed earned rather than extracted. The myth of paternalism became especially useful. In this version, the planter is stern but benevolent, a caretaker of a dependent labour force, guiding a little rural kingdom with responsibility and occasional kindness. It is a convenient fantasy, because it transforms domination into guardianship. One can almost hear the self-satisfaction in it. Look how generous I am to the people I legally own. A remarkable moral achievement. Apparently, such myths relied heavily on selective vision. A visitor might be shown the big house, the neat avenue of trees, the productive fields, perhaps even cabins if they looked orderly enough. He would not necessarily be invited to count how many hours of labour went into that order, how many punishments had secured it, or how many family ties had been broken to maintain the estate. Presentation mattered. Plantation society was deeply concerned with reputation. Reputation often grows best in the soil of careful omission. Printed descriptions, travel accounts, and later nostalgic writings helped further this softened image. Some writers admired Virginia landscapes and manners while glancing lightly past the labor system beneath them. Others acknowledged slavery but described it as regrettable, paternal, or civilizing. It is astonishing what people will call civilizing when the profits are good enough. Even language like servant, hand, or dependent could blur the actual condition of bondage and making coercion sound almost contractual. The tobacco economy also produced myths about black labor itself. Enslaved people were sometimes described as naturally suited to heat, field work, or discipline, as though brutality were merely agricultural common sense. Such claims were not innocent misunderstandings. They were ideological tools. If black people could be imagined as especially fitted for hard labor, then the system exploiting them could be recast as practical rather than immoral. Pseudoscience and prejudice met in the field and shook hands quite warmly. At the same time, black labourers were denied full credit for their expertise. Plantation records might praise a good crop while centering the owner's management. A prosperous estate became evidence of white skill, white prudence, and white civilization. The knowledge held by enslaved workers disappeared into the background like smoke. This is one reason the historical record can feel so slippery. Achievement is visible everywhere, but the names attached to it are often the wrong ones. Consumption completed the disguise. A smoker in Britain or the northern states encountered cured tobacco as a finished commodity, not as a chain of human labour. Merchants calculated quality and price. Consumers judged taste and aroma. The leaf became a habit, a pleasure, a social ritual, even a symbol of sophistication. Very few people holding the product were forced to smell the curing barn, hear the overseer, or watch a worker stooped over rows in late summer heat. Distance did moral work on behalf of the market. There is scholarly debate over how much ordinary consumers understood about the brutality behind plantation products. Some surely knew enough to suspect, others knew in fragments. Some accepted slavery openly, some kept the reality at emotional arm's length. What matters is that the system did not require universal ignorance. It required enough convenience, enough rationalization, and enough social permission for the trade to continue. Most profitable systems survive quite well on partial knowledge. The physical landscape itself became part of the myth. Virginia's rivers, rolling fields, and old houses later invited romantic interpretation. Painters, tourists, and local memory often favoured picturesque scenes over labour history. A lane lined with trees photographs beautifully. It does not announce who planted, trimmed, and walked it under orders. A quiet brick manor at sunset can seem almost serene until one asks what funded the brick, who made the bricks, and who slept in far poorer quarters within sight of the same sky. A quirky detail from plantation display reveals the gap between image and labour. Some elite households prized imported tableware, decorative furniture, and fashionable clothing purchased through credit tied to crop sales. In other words, the refined tea service and polished silver could be resting materially on tobacco leaves handled by enslaved workers with stained hands and aching backs. The elegant dinner table and the rough field were not separate worlds. They were the same economy wearing different fabrics. Debt complicated the myth further. Many planters were not effortlessly wealthy masters floating on endless success. They were often entangled in credit networks, worried about prices, shipments, weather, and obligations to merchants. This does not make them sympathetic heroes. It does explain why they pushed labour so hard. Their gentility often sat on top of financial anxiety. The polished manners of the Virginia elite could coexist quite comfortably with ruthless extraction because profit pressure and status pressure reinforced each other. The myth also required minimizing black interior life. Plantation nostalgia tended to depict enslaved people as loyal, simple, cheerful, or dependent, always orbiting the white household as background figures in someone else's family album. Such portrayals were not just inaccurate, they were strategic. A labour force imagined as content is easier to exploit in memory. A people imagined without complexity are easier to erase from the story of how wealth was made, but the record resists complete erasure. Runaway ads, court cases, plantation complaints, sales lists, and occasional personal narratives all crack the polished surface. They reveal resistance, grief, skill, family attachment, injury, and fear. They show owners worrying about disobedience, theft, flight, and declining labour. They reveal that the supposedly harmonious plantation was in fact an unstable arrangement held together by force and constant management. The myth survives only if one looks away from the paperwork too closely connected to real life. Public memory after slavery often softened the image even more. As the Civil War receded and lost cause nostalgia spread, plantation culture was recast by many white Southerners as graceful and honourable. Tobacco regions participated in this sentimental makeover. The old estate became a symbol of heritage rather than exploitation. Porches, columns, and family silver received attention. Slave quarters, labour routines, and sale blocks did not receive equal tenderness. Memory, when guided by power, can become interior decorating for injustice, yet black communities kept other memories alive. Stories of labour, cruelty, endurance, skill, family, and land moved through generations, not always in full detail, not always in written form, but in names, warnings, songs, and inherited understanding. The official public myth was never the only memory in circulation. It was simply the one with more institutions behind it for a very long time. The atmosphere of a plantation tour in later generations could be deeply strange. A guide might praise architecture while the ground itself held the unspoken weight of the lives spent in bondage. The breeze through old trees might seem peaceful. Birdsong might fill the yard. Bricks warmed by afternoon light might look charming. It takes a deliberate effort not to let beauty perform moral laundering. Landscapes can be lovely and violent at once. Virginia often asks you to hold both truths together. What really happened then was not only that black Americans worked tobacco farms in Virginia under brutal conditions, it was also that their labour was transformed into wealth, and then into story, and that story was repeatedly edited to protect the dignity of those who benefited most. Tobacco built fortunes, houses, offices, and reputations. It also built myths. Those myths did almost as much long-term damage as the crop itself, because they taught generations to admire the surface while ignoring the foundation. Evening settles over the river. The warehouses stand quiet now. The leaves are packed, the silver is polished, the account books are closed. Somewhere in the dark, smoke still drifts from cabin chimneys, carrying the smell of supper and worn wood. One world gets remembered in portraits. The other made the portraits possible. Freedom arrives with paperwork, rumours, uniforms, prayers, and disbelief on Virginia tobacco land. Emancipation did not descend like a clean sunrise that instantly warmed every field. It came unevenly, felt through news carried by soldiers, preachers, travellers, black communities, and trembling word of mouth. It came into places where cabins still stood, barns still smelled of leaf, and owners still expected labour to begin at dawn. The legal world shifted. The landscape did not immediately forget its habits. For black Americans on tobacco farms, the end of slavery was both rupture and continuation. One kind of bondage had been broken in law, but the fields remained, the land remained in white hands, and the people who had profited from forced labour often stayed exactly where they were. You can imagine the strange stillness of such a moment. The same road, the same river, the same barn beams. Yet the meaning of stepping across the yard had changed. News of freedom was not always believed at once. That hesitation makes perfect sense. If every authority figure in your life has spent years lying, coercing, punishing, and controlling movement, why should one astonishing message be accepted immediately? Some owners tried to hide the news, delay it, or reinterpret it in their own favour. Some continued acting as if nothing fundamental had changed. Black Virginians often had to test freedom before trusting it, and that testing could be dangerous. One of the first transformations involved movement. People began searching openly for kin. A wife might look for a husband from whom she had long been separated. A mother might seek children sold away years earlier. A brother might follow rumours across counties, roads filled with hope and uncertainty. The physical act of walking, once governed by pass systems and patrols, now held a different moral charge. To choose your destination with your own purpose was no small thing. The emotional force of family reunification is hard to exaggerate. Notices were placed. Questions were asked in churches, towns, camps, and roadside conversations. Names were repeated carefully. Ages guessed. Old scars and remembered songs became identifying details. Some reunions happened, some failed. Some people discovered that those they sought were dead, gone farther south, or impossible to trace. Freedom opened the search. It did not guarantee the finding. Marriage also entered public life differently. Couples whose bonds had long been real in the quarters but invisible in law could now seek legal recognition. There is something quietly profound in that shift. A relationship once treated as incidental to property arrangements could be named, recorded, and acknowledged as family. The act did not erase the pain of years lived without legal protection. It did give form to commitments that slavery had refused to honour. Work, however, remained unavoidable. Emancipation did not hand out land, tools, secure wages, and weatherproof houses to all who had laboured in bondage. Most freed people still needed food, shelter, and income immediately, and white landowners still controlled most of the local resources. So many black Virginians stayed on or near the same farms, now under labour contracts, wage arrangements, tenancy systems, or share agreements that varied widely in fairness and enforcement. This is where old power learned new vocabulary. The overseer might fade as a title, but supervision did not vanish. The whip lost legal legitimacy, but coercion adapted through debt, eviction threats, withheld pay, cheating in accounts, and local intimidation. A contract could be presented as freedom while being enforced in ways that left very little room to negotiate. A labourer might technically choose employment and still discover that every available choice had been designed by people committed to preserving hierarchy. Tobacco itself continued to shape the terms of life. The crop still demanded timing, labour, and skill. Freed people knew the work intimately. That knowledge gave them a degree of leverage, because landowners needed experienced hands. Yet knowledge without land remained a narrow advantage. If you know exactly how to raise the crop but someone else owns the fields, barns, tools, and local credit, freedom can feel frustratingly partial. Better than slavery? Yes. Fully secure? No. The labour contract became one of the central documents of this new world. On paper it could specify wages, duties, rations, housing, and terms of employment. In practice, the balance of power often remained unequal. Illiteracy, local prejudice, and dependence limited bargaining power for many freed people. Employers might alter terms, delay payment, or impose deductions that swallowed earnings. The ledger had changed tone, but it still leaned heavily toward white control. Some black families moved away from plantation centres when they could, seeking towns, kin networks, church communities, or land opportunities elsewhere. Others stayed because moving required resources they did not possess, or because staying near known places and people felt safer than venturing into uncertainty. Freedom did not produce one universal response. It produced choices, and choices are always shaped by what a person can actually risk. Church life grew in importance. Independent black congregations and gatherings became central spaces for worship. Political discussion, education, and social organisation. In these places, freedom could be spoken aloud in fuller terms than a labour contract ever allowed. A church was not only a spiritual shelter, it was also a schoolroom, a meeting hall, a news centre, and a public statement that black life would no longer be organised solely through the plantation. Education became a deep hunger. Adults and children sought reading and writing with remarkable determination. Schools for freed people, whether formally organised or more improvised, represented far more than simple literacy. They represented entry into citizenship, contracts read with one's own eyes, letters sent across distance, Bible passages interpreted without mediation, and children growing toward a future not entirely scripted by white authority. A person learning letters after dark in a rough room was doing something quietly revolutionary. Historians still debate the degree to which emancipation transformed labour discipline on specific Virginia tobacco farms in the immediate years after the Civil War. Some emphasise continuity in white economic power. Others note real gains in autonomy, mobility, family stability, and community institutions despite harsh constraints. Both observations can be true at once. The plantation order did not disappear overnight. Neither did black agency wait politely for ideal conditions before asserting itself. Land remained the great unfinished question. Many freed people wanted land ownership because they understood perfectly well that independence without a secure economic base could be snatched away. Owning a plot meant not merely profit, but control over time, family labour, food production, and dignity. Yet large-scale redistribution never arrived in the way many hoped, so the countryside entered a long period in which black labour remained essential, while black control over land remained sharply limited. Debt became a frequent trap. A family might rent land, buy supplies on credit, and settle accounts after harvest, only to learn that charges had eaten away most or all of the return. The old plantation had used ownership of persons. The new countryside often used ownership of land and access to credit. Neither system was identical. Both could narrow the path to independence with depressing efficiency. The political world also grew more dangerous in new ways. During Reconstruction, black men in Virginia and across the South entered public life through voting, office holding, conventions, militia service, and political organizing. This expansion of citizenship provoked fierce white backlash, intimidation, fraud, economic pressure, and violence sought to push black people back toward dependency. The tobacco region became part of this wider struggle over what freedom would mean in practice. Women's labour remained heavy and central. Freed women pursued family stability, wage work, domestic labour, field labour, laundry, market activity, and church life, while also pressing for greater control over their own households. One important post-emancipation change involved insisting that children not be hired out so readily, or pushed into labour under old assumptions. Black parents often tried to protect childhood more intentionally where they could, though poverty and local power structures made that difficult. A quirky but telling detail of this era is the importance of surnames. After emancipation, many freed people selected, kept, changed, or formalised family names in ways that mattered deeply. Some took the names of former owners, sometimes by pressure, familiarity, or practical necessity. Others chose different surnames to mark kinship, dignity, or new beginnings. A name on paper now carried legal and emotional weight in a changed world. It was not just a label, it was a claim. Cemeteries and burial practices tell another story of aftermath. With greater autonomy, black communities could more openly shape how their dead were remembered. Graveyards near churches or community spaces became places of continuity, where names, dates, and relationships gained more visible permanence. After generations of sale and separation, to mark a grave in chosen ground carried a depth of meaning difficult to overstate. Memory of slavery lived on in bodies and habits too. An elder might still glance sharply at hoofbeats on a road. A woman might hide food as if scarcity were always one bad season away. A man might avoid direct eye contact with white authority, out of learned caution even while legally free. Trauma does not vanish because a document says it should. The nervous system keeps its own archives. Yet pleasure and ambition entered the countryside in new forms. A paid harvest, however modest. A wedding recognised by law. A child tracing letters on a slate. A church meeting full of song. A family meal eaten on a Sunday not governed by an owner's whim. These were not trivial scenes. They were the texture of a different future trying to assemble itself from limited materials. Over time, Virginia tobacco culture kept evolving. Markets shifted. Other crops mattered. Industrial processing grew. Cigarette manufacturing and urban commerce changed the wider economy, but the old farms remained part of the state's memory and land use. The wealth drawn from black labour did not evaporate at emancipation. It stayed in property, institutions, family fortunes, and regional development. The legacy was economic as well as emotional. That legacy also shaped the stories families told. Descendants of enslaved black Virginians carried forward accounts of fieldwork, sales, skilled labour, midwives, songs, warnings, and names. Some memories blurred over time, some stayed razor-sharp. White families too inherited stories, though often filtered through nostalgia or silence. Across generations, the question of what really happened on tobacco farms never disappeared. It simply waited for listeners willing to hear more than the myth. If you stand quietly on such land at dusk, you can sense layers of time at once. The smell of earth after rain, the rough path where wagons once passed, a church bell somewhere beyond the fields, young leaves lifting in the breeze. The place is no innocent blank. It holds labour, prayer, money, grief, endurance, law, and memory together in one landscape. What happened to black Americans on Virginia tobacco farms did not end with emancipation. Slavery ended. The consequences continued. Families rebuilt themselves as best they could. Communities formed schools and churches. Labour systems changed shape. Citizenship expanded and was attacked. Land remained contested. Memory moved from whispers to records, from scars to surnames, from cabins and fields into the long American argument over what freedom is worth when justice arrives late and incomplete. Now the night softens. The fields lie still under a dim wash of moonlight. The rows no longer call for hands, at least not for this hour. A breeze moves across the tobacco leaves with a faint papery sound, gentle enough to almost resemble breathing. Somewhere beyond the farm, a church window glows. Somewhere else, a child practices a letter by lamplight, tongue pressed in concentration, building a future one careful line at a time. Let the land grow quieter. The barns settle into darkness. The roads empty. Frogs take over the low places near the water, and crickets stitch a soft pattern through the air. Smoke from an evening fire drifts upward and thins into the night. The weight of history remains, but it no longer needs to shout. It rests in names remembered, in family stories held close, in songs carried farther than the fields ever intended. You can let your thoughts drift now. Picture tired hands finally unclenching. Picture a door closing softly against the cool air. Picture a table with enough light for reading, enough peace for prayer, enough room for loved ones to sit near one another without fear of being counted as property. The old world does not vanish completely, but it loosens, bit by bit, breath by breath. The river keeps moving in the dark, patient as ever. It carries moonlight where it once carried cargo. Pines stand watch along the edges of the road. The earth gives back the day's heat slowly. Somewhere a lullaby rises and fades. Somewhere an elder speaks a family name with care, making sure it stays alive for one more generation. Rest there for a moment, in the hush after labour, after law, after grief spoken aloud. What remains is not only sorrow, it is endurance made gentle. It is memory refusing to disappear. It is the quiet dignity of people who kept building life where life was denied them, and who kept carrying one another toward morning. End of script. Sleep well.